They say I was born to embody perfection. From a young age, I was molded to appear flawless, as if I were an extension of an ancient dynasty, even if rooted in American soil. My family isn't royalty, but the way we're treated would make anyone think otherwise. I grew up under the weight of a surname that opened doors and closed choices. Every gesture was scrutinized, every step analyzed. They called me princess in society columns, as if it were a title, not a prison. Polite smiles, impeccable clothes, rehearsed speeches, everything so meticulously calculated that little by little, I lost myself within my own image. But that night, that silent night, where everything seemed the same, yet everything changed, I saw him. And in that instant, without a single word from him, I understood I was facing something my entire life had avoided. Someone who didn't see me as a symbol, but as a woman. I had stepped out just to breathe, to escape the gilded halls, the etiquette, the walls lined with history. I was wandering aimlessly behind the estate when my eyes met his. He stood by the side gate in absolute silence, watching the darkness with a focus that felt deeper than those who live under spotlights. His uniform was simple, his posture straight, his presence so understated it could have gone unnoticed by anyone, except me. Because in that moment, weary of being everything expected of me, I found in his quiet gaze a kind of mirror that didn't distort. He didn't look away, he didn't smile, he didn't speak, but he didn't hide either. And that small detail, that silent courage, pierced me in a way no other presence ever had. I felt my body react, my blood quicken, and for a second, I wasn't the heiress, nor the magnate's daughter, nor the perfect girl. I was just me. And that me was someone I didn't yet know. I went back inside without a word, but inside, something had been ignited. And no matter how I tried to extinguish it with logic or fear, it was too late. Because sometimes, a single honest glance at the exact right moment is enough for everything that seemed unchangeable to start crumbling. Tiiskot besimitas. The days that followed, I tried to pretend that moment hadn't touched me. I returned to my usual routine with the same polished expression, the same tone of voice I'd been taught since childhood, one that conveys sweetness without revealing anything. But there was a new disorder within me, a kind of pulse that didn't fit the perfect world I'd been raised in. And every night, even without a reason, I found an excuse to go out, a book left in the garden, a supposed phone call outside, a walk to clear my mind. It was a lie, of course, but I didn't even admit it to myself. I went out because I wanted to see him. Because that night guard, silent and invisible to the eyes of the household, had awakened me with a single glance, more than any compliment I'd received in a lifetime of appearances. Sometimes he was in the same spot. Other times I'd find him by the side fence, checking the cameras with a focus that seemed to allow no distractions. But every time our eyes met, something happened. No smiles, no forced pleasantries, but there was presence. And that presence made me feel alive. I started noticing details, the way he kept his hands steady, how he always scanned the surroundings before responding, as if he carried the habit of protecting everything around him. And yet, he never asked questions about me. He never took advantage of my position. He spoke little, and when he did, his words felt heavy with meaning. I had to teach my heart to adapt to the slowness of this bond. It wasn't the kind of story that happened quickly. It was the kind that grew like roots, silent, firm, deep. I began teasing him with light words, feigning disinterest, trying to decipher who he really was. His name was Nathan. I learned this by chance, in a brief conversation with one of the estate's drivers. But to me, he was more than a name. He was a feeling, the feeling of something that shouldn't happen, but was happening. And the more I watched him, the more I realized he was struggling with it too. There was a carefulness in his gestures around me, a restraint that only someone who feels deeply tries to mask. And it was that carefulness that made me trust him. For the first time, I shared something of myself. I told him about a night when, at 18, I tried to run away and turned back before even reaching the bus station. He just listened. He didn't say he understood, didn't try to console me. He was just there, present, with a silence that felt safer than any embrace I'd ever received. And then came the night when touch happened. Unplanned, unannounced. Just our hands meeting by chance or by impulse, or perhaps because there was no longer any way to avoid it. It wasn't a bold gesture. It was a brief, honest, almost shy touch. But it was there that I understood what was forming. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a distraction. It was something growing in silence, without permission, defying all the rules that had kept me safe until then. And when we pulled away, our eyes locked, I knew. We were no longer in the territory of doubt. We were crossing a line from which there's no return. After that night, nothing between us remained discreet, at least not inside. Outwardly, everything was still cloaked in silences and appearances. He remained the night guard, I, the perfect heiress everyone praised without truly knowing. But behind the scenes of routine, in the empty spaces of the day and the long stretches of midnight, something new hovered between us. The certainty that we were navigating uncharted territory. There were no kisses, no declarations. But the time between one glance and the next carried a tension so vivid, so dense, it made me tremble inside. And the most surprising thing was that I didn't want to run. For the first time, I wanted to stay. I wanted to see how far it could go. I wanted to know how much the heart can withstand before it surrenders. Nathan began to open up little by little. One of those midnights he told me he'd served for years in another state, that he'd left everything behind after a loss he chose not to name. There was pain in the depth of his voice, but also a contained calm, like someone who'd already cried all they needed and now simply carried on. I didn't ask more. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I understood he'd speak when he was ready, and I respected that with a naturalness I didn't even know I had. With him, I learned the value of silence. I learned that not all affection needs to be spoken, that sometimes just being there, steady, whole, looking into each other's eyes, is worth more than any promise. I started to feel fear, not of what I felt, but of what could happen if anyone found out. The difference between our realities was stark, cruel, and yet completely irrelevant when I was by his side. But outside that space, the world was different. I overheard talk of my public image, the ideal suitor, the allied families expecting me to represent something greater than my desires. And it all sounded increasingly foreign, as if it had lost meaning the moment he entered my life. I no longer wanted to be a chess piece in a game of appearances. I wanted to breathe deeply beside someone who saw me without pretense, and Nathan saw me every time. One night I brought a book with me, one of my favorites. I opened it to the last pages and read a passage aloud, without asking if he wanted to hear. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he simply said, "Is that how you feel?" And in that moment I realized how much he understood me, effortlessly, without needing to unravel me like a puzzle. He just saw, and being seen that way, without judgment, without fear, without any motive beyond truth, undid me irreversibly. I could no longer hide it. I loved him. Even if I didn't say it aloud, even if he didn't know it, I loved him with the kind of love that blooms in the shadows, but carries too much light to stay hidden for long. What we lived began to grow, as all things that shouldn't, in secret, between short moments and long silences. but with an intensity neither of us could control anymore. And the more we tried to keep it within a facade of normalcy, the more the feeling took shape, the more our eyes betrayed the calm our mouths tried to uphold. It was like we were trapped in a silent dance, where every movement carried a weight. Only we understood. I started waiting for him like someone waiting for their own breath. The days became mere obstacles between our nights. And even without kisses or open declarations, what existed between us was already more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. He began to call me by my name in a low voice, only when we were alone. And every time Nathan said, "Elena," something in me unraveled. It was as if in that sound lay permission to exist outside my armor, to be more than someone's important daughter, more than the perfect woman molded to fit frames. With him, I was imperfect and free. And the most dangerous part of it all is that freedom is addictive. And I, who'd spent my life being admired by everyone, realized no one had ever loved me the way he looked at me. But the world doesn't. Sleep forever. And a story like ours, no matter how careful, would leave traces. One afternoon, while I was in a meeting with my father and the company's advisors, I heard his name mentioned by a security assistant. A stray comment, an unusual movement, a veiled suspicion. My blood ran cold. It felt like the ground was tilting slowly. They didn't say anything directly, but the tone, the look, the subtext, it all told me something was being noticed. I returned to my room that day on high alert. My thoughts were in disarray. For the first time, fear spoke louder than desire. That same night, I couldn't wait. I went out earlier than usual and sought him. He was already there, but something about him was different. Before I could say anything, he spoke, his voice low, his eyes steady, but filled with conflict. "They're getting suspicious." A tightness gripped my chest so fiercely I had to breathe deeply not to collapse. I tried to argue, to say we could be more careful, that nothing was confirmed, but he just looked at me in a way that silenced me. "If this reaches you, Elena, they'll use you as an example. I've seen it happen, and you know it's true." We stood in silence, and in that silence, everything in me screamed, because what he said was real, but also cruel. The possibility of losing him, even to protect him, was unbearable. I wanted to run, to flee, to abandon everything. But he was right, and I loved him too much to let him pay the price for something the world wasn't ready to accept. And in that moment, for the first time, I understood that sometimes loving someone isn't holding on, it's letting go, even when the heart begs for a different path. He vanished before I could decide if I was ready to let him go. He didn't say goodbye, left no note, no scene, no shared tears. He simply disappeared. They said he'd been transferred to another security unit, that it was an administrative decision, nothing personal. But I knew. Nathan left because he chose to protect what we had, even if it meant erasing his own footsteps. And the worst part is that I understood. I understood every reason, every silence, every absence. But that didn't make it easier to bear the void. He left. Time, which once dragged while I waited for him, now passed like a shadow too long over my days. I smiled for those who expected my smile, fulfilled obligations, played roles with precision. But inside, I was in ruins, and no one noticed. Because no one truly looked. Sometimes I'd pass through the corridors where we used to meet and pause, as if listening for something no longer there. Deep down, I still hoped to hear his footsteps, to see his figure around the fence's curve, any sign he'd return. But nothing. The silence was now just silence, a silence that hurt. I became quieter, more reserved. My mother noticed. She said I was more introspective, asked if everything was okay. I lied gently as I always had. But inside, something burned slowly, like a candle forgotten at the back of the room. It wasn't just longing. It was a bitter certainty that I'd lost something I might never find again. Not a man, but the freedom to be whole with someone. Weeks turned into months. I was introduced to carefully chosen suitors, all proper, polite, financially stable, and empty. Not for who they were, but for what they didn't awaken in me. None of them made me forget the way Nathan said my name, or how he listened in silence, his eyes full of the world. I started dreaming of him often, dreams where he returned without explanation, where everything was simple, where our hands met, as if time hadn't passed. And when I woke, the pillow still tasted of the tears that fell unbidden. On the last night of winter, I found, inside one of the books I used to take to the garden, a small folded paper. It was from him. I recognized his handwriting instantly. It didn't say much. Nathan never did. It was a short sentence, almost a whisper. If the world doesn't allow you, know that I choose you in silence every day. I held that paper in my hands for hours. I didn't know how he'd left it there. I didn't know if it meant he was nearby, if it was a farewell or a promise. But in that moment I understood that the love we'd lived hadn't ended. It had only taken another form, more mature, more invisible, but still alive. And with that, I learned that sometimes loving someone is feeling their presence, even when their body is gone. Because certain souls don't leave us. They just wait for the right time to return. The reunion didn't happen like in the movies, with frantic runs or loud declarations in a crowd. It was simple, calm, unexpected, and for that very reason, devastating. I was leaving a charity event, the kind where everyone wears their best smiles and talks about causes they don't truly understand. I'd shaken too many hands, heard too many empty compliments, and all I wanted was silence. I was about to get into the car when I saw him. Standing across the street, Nathan. His hair slightly longer, his face thinner, but the same eyes. And for a second, I thought it was a hallucination. Because it was impossible. Because it had been months. Because no one returns like that, out of nowhere, with the same look as before, and the same presence that upends everything without a word. But he was there, real, and looking at me as if time hadn't passed, as if all the silences and distances were just pauses, never endings. I crossed the street without thinking, and he waited, still, as always. When I stopped in front of him, we said nothing. Neither of us knew where to start, and maybe we didn't need to start, because we'd never ended. He took a deep breath before speaking. I shouldn't be here. And I replied, my voice breaking, but you are. And that was everything. That was enough. We walked in silence, side by side, to the next block. And there, between a tree and a dim street light, he told me. He said he'd left out of fear, yes, but also out of hope. Hope that time would set things right. Hope that when he returned, he'd no longer be a threat, but a possible choice. I listened with my heart beating erratically, as if my entire body were trying to keep up with the emotion of being near him again. And then he took my hand, unhurried, without doubt, like someone holding something that already belongs to them. I know it's still hard, but if you want, now I stay. And I smiled. A smile full of tears, because that was exactly what I'd been waiting for since the first day. Not a castle, nor a scandal, nor impossible promises. Just this, that he'd stay, that he'd choose me, even with the entire world around us saying it made no sense. In the days that followed, we started slowly, without haste, without guilt. People around us were surprised, of course. Some judged, others stayed silent, but it no longer mattered. Because after everything, after all the absence, all the pain, we both knew. True love isn't measured by others' approval. It's measured by the courage to stay. And he stayed. And I chose not to run anymore. Now when we walk together through the streets, people still look as if trying to figure out who we are. And the answer is simple. We're two who resisted. Two who didn't give up. Two who loved when it wasn't allowed and kept loving anyway. Today, he still works in security. Not as a night guard, but at a small, discreet company where one calls him invisible. I'm still called a princess by some, though now the word carries a different weight. It no longer holds the obligation to please or perform. It carries the memory of who I was when I met him. We keep walking together, sometimes in silence, but with hearts at peace. Our love isn't a movie, nor does it need to be. It's made of choice. Every day. The choice to be there, to respect, to stay. Sometimes I look at him and still wonder how something so improbable survived time, fear, and the world. And then he looks back at me, and I understand. True love doesn't need permission. It just happens and stays.